Or what's the name that he's known by in some English sources? Tamerlane, yeah, or Tamberlane, to use the name of a play by Marlowe, for instance, on him. And here you have a lot of blue arrows going out in every direction from Samarkand. Samarkand was his capital, and the blue arrows represent campaigns that he took his army on to either subdue neighboring countries or to obtain booty from them. So if you can imagine these arrows turning back on themselves and going from all of these places, Delhi, Damascus, Anatolia, back to Samarkand, that gives you an idea of the wealth, the riches that were available to Timur for his building campaigns. And he was particularly fond of architecture, didn't like book painting, too small, not impressive enough, but he really liked big buildings to match his personality, to reflect his dominance over the Islamic world, perhaps. So Samarkand was quite near his birthplace, Shahri-Sabz, and he expanded from there, first of all, mostly into territories that were held by the Chagatai Khanate. That was the neighboring area of the Il Khanids. Well, they had broken up, of course, after the death of Abu Sa'id. Subdued this area. Then there were several campaigns in Iran. There was one very long campaign that went westwards as far as Ankara, where he defeated the Ottoman Sultan Bayezid, and then went further on down to Damascus. Now this 1402, who would have been in charge of Damascus at this time? The Mamluks, and in particular Farag ibn Bar'u was the reigning sultan at the time. He decided discretion was the better part of valor, so he stayed in Cairo and waited Timur out until there aren't such good grazing grounds for the sheep and the horses that accompany nomadic armies. That's probably why the Mongols stopped there on earlier campaigns, and similarly to Timur decided not to try to go further into Cairo, but went back to Samarkand then. Another major, not really a campaign of subjugation, but just a raid for booty was into Delhi a little bit later. And in 1404, he had just left Samarkand, was on his way to attack China with a huge army when he died. And so the army turned back, and the members of the family started fighting among themselves as to who would take over the succession. There was an appointed successor, but one of the ways in which you stopped your children from trying to take over your throne was to make them weak. So you appointed them in different areas, and you made sure that no one of them got particularly strong. So there was a civil war essentially for about 10 years until one son, Shah Rukh, emerged as victorious. He had been the governor of Herat, nowadays in western Afghanistan, and not surprisingly he made Herat his capital, and he put his own son in Samarkand, Ulu Beg. Now let's see the the list of buildings that you have today. We have several that are in Samarkand. All of the ones under Timur are in Samarkand, but under Shah Rukh we have in a town that isn't marked here, Mashhad, between Herat and Merv. There's one complex we'll be looking at. We have two in Herat. We have also one in Khargird, which is a small village today to the west of Herat. And then maybe we'll get to the Karakoyunlu building in Tabriz, which is here west of the Caspian Sea. Good morning. Could you try and come in time, please? It's 10 past 10. Thank you. So, the first building complex we're going to look at is called the Shah-i-Zinda, which is a necropolis on the outskirts of Samarkand. What's a necropolis? A necropolis.
It's kind of like an enclosure thing on it. That's
What does it have within the enclosure?
most important buildings, government buildings.
No. Mm. Tombs, yeah. It's a collection of tombs. Not just a cemetery usually, but something that has buildings, mausoleums. You're thinking of metropolis, sorry. Okay, I didn't, yeah.
Why does it have Acropolis? I didn't care.
The Acropolis is the high, the building on top of a hill, that's right, yeah. So, Shah-i-Zinda means the living king in Persian. And the living king was supposed to be the uncorrupted bones of Qusam ibn Abbas, who was one of the companions of the Prophet and who spread Islam in Central Asia. So he's buried in one of these little mausoleums here. But because of the barakah, the blessings that you could obtain from being buried in proximity to him, lots of other mausoleums grew up in the same spot. And we'll be looking at a couple of these. One here, number 13, which is Shadi Malik Agha, and another one up here, Tuman Agha, which are both part of the family of Timur. So here's a general view of the area. This is the dome of the second one we'll be looking at. This small dome in the foreground is where the Shah-i-Zinda, the living king himself, is buried. There's a kind of processional way which pilgrims would walk up, going past these mausoleums on their way to visit the main shrine. But this is the first one on your list. This is the Shadi Malik Agha of 1371. You need to get these. And we're looking at the facade, the entrance facade of the building. Anything strike you about the entrance facade, first of all? It looks tall, maybe just because of the perspective. It's leaning inwards a bit because the camera was tilted upwards, so that's a bit misleading. I mean, it's impressive enough, but the doorway, maybe someone would come up to about here in the doorway. So it's not huge. It's nothing like the old Jaitu Mausoleum, for instance. What about the decoration?
So it's originally tiled on the outside, like completely tiled?
Yeah, I mean it is almost, most of the tile is still present. There's a little bit that is fallen off, but it's mostly in good condition. Yes, it might have been a little bit taller as well. This inscription may have come across horizontally and then finished down here. But the top of it has gone. But the tile work is particularly interesting. Now, on the questions that were given to me in the last class, one of the ones was, what's the difference between overglaze and underglaze painted tile work? So, just to help you in distinguishing between these, here is a list of the main tile work techniques that were employed in Iran in particular, but you'll find example of these in other parts of the Islamic world as well. We have tile mosaic, carved and glazed terracotta, underglaze painted and overglaze painted. So, underglaze painted, you paint the colored glazes onto the clay base, and then you cover them with a translucent glaze, and then you fire that all in one go. So underglaze means the colors are under the glaze. So what's the advantage? It preserves the colors very well because you have a protective glaze on top of them. The disadvantage is that it's harder to control the colors because, well, they run together frequently. As opposed to overglaze painted, and there's another term that's used for this, cuerda seca, which means colorless line in Spanish. There's a similar type of tiles that were produced in Spain to the ones that were produced here. And what you do is you fire the tile once with a white glazed base, and then you paint enamel colors, which have lots of silica in them, just like the components of glass. If you fired those at the same temperature as the base, they would run together. So in order to prevent that, you fire them at a lower temperature, and that stops them running together. But the disadvantage is that they are matte. They're not glossy. They're not shiny. Now, we've seen one type of overglaze painted tile work before. What was that? Anyone remember? It had another name, actually. From Minai it is a type of overglaze painted technique, that's true, but we didn't cover it in this class. You find that in some earlier Seljuk buildings and in Seljuk pottery. And there are some good examples of it in the Islamic Museum as well. But one that we saw that had, for instance, Chinese motifs on it.
The running phoenix?
The phoenix, yeah, there was a phoenix and another one with a dragon. So those were in overglaze painted technique. Anyone remember the name? The name comes from the color of the base glaze that was used for it, which was a dark blue. Word meaning dark blue in Persian. Lajvardina, or Lajvardin. So that's another type of overglaze painting. There are another couple of techniques there that we'll talk about in just a minute. Here is, well, what do you call this part of the building? Okay, it's beside the spandrel, exactly, yeah. So this is a detail of this area here. The area beside the top of the arch, the spandrel. What type of techniques are we looking at here in the spandrel?
Overglaze painting?
Which part?
On the spandrel, or is that Mosaic?
Well, there are actually two different techniques here. There's one in the epigraphic medallion in the middle. And then what kind of motifs are these, by the way? What's the inspiration for these floral shapes?
Chinese lotus.
Yeah. Here's the lotus. Here's a more complicated form of it. So closely based in Chinese forms. And these are in different techniques, actually. There are different colors. This has a dark blue base with white and green painting on top of it.
There's some green, yeah.
Yeah. So, in fact, the green over the green painting on top of another color, that's usually a sure sign that you're looking at overglaze painting. So this is an example of overglaze painting. And since it's on a dark blue background, you could call this Lajvardin as well. This one, okay, if you have a look at the handout that I've given, for instance, it tells you that the most common colors are dark blue and white, and sometimes with black outlining and with some turquoise staining. So a little bit of turquoise for highlights. In fact, there's quite a bit of turquoise here. So the limited range of colors here is something that will alert you to the fact that you are looking at underglaze painting here. So we have these two types. Now, the one after this that I'm going to show you is a detail of this area of the portal. So here again, in fact, we have a couple of different techniques. There's one that's used for all of this band, and another one that's used for all of this band. Have a look at the handout and see if you can recognize. Now, when you say this, do you mean the one on the left or the one on the right?
Left.
This whole panel. Well, what are the colors? What are the range of colors that you see?
White.
White,
Dark blue.
dark blue,
Turquoise.
and turquoise.
That's it.
That's it. Okay, that limited range of colors and those particular colors are typical of underglaze painted. Yeah.
It looks shiny.
It is shiny. That's the whole point. The shiniest of them all are underglaze painted. The ones that are less shiny are the overglaze painted. They are matte colors on top of a glossy base, but this is the translucent gloss on the left-hand side that covers all of the colors and makes it look very shiny. But have a look at your list and see if you can figure out what this one might be. I'm not sure if it's obvious here, but there's a lot of,
Mustard.
no, just wait, a lot of different depth in the carvings here.
Carved and glazed.
Yeah, carved and glazed terracotta. So it's molded, in fact, carved before it's fired, and that's why you can get a repeated pattern. And so the colors, yeah, usually also light and dark blue, sometimes manganese purple. I don't see the purple here. And just to confuse matters for us, they've got little bosses in the center where they have overglaze painted decoration, a little bit of green on top of the dark blue ground. Okay, there's some writing on the end of this. Most of you read Arabic. Okay, stop you, yes, to stop you having to crick your neck, we can turn it sideways. It's the date. What's the date? Okay. You're right, it is a date, and obviously there's a limited range of numbers that are available. So we have a number in the hundreds, a number in the decades, a number in the units. What are they? Well, the interesting thing about it, of course, well, what is unusual about the calligraphy here?
It's, I want to say it's almost abstract, but you can still read it. So.
Yes, you can still read it, but you're right. It's very different from.
Very watery.
It's not as overlapping. Yani, everyone is not touching the other as much as usual.
Okay, but is there anything else that's unusual about it compared with typical Arabic calligraphy?
There's, wait, no.
It's very zigzag.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's not quite so unusual, but there's a feature that, I mean, look at what's before the word for the year? Yeah, because why can't you find it? You know where the word sana is?
Sana?
Yeah, where the word for year that's that comes before the date usually. Where is it in this inscription?
Oh, it's not sun.
No, it is there.
Oh, darn it.
Sana? It's the lower one?
There, pointed out.
Yeah. This?
Okay, but there's something before it.
What was going on?
This one?
Well, that's the word before it. The unusual thing is that they're joining up letters that are, and even words that are completely separate normally, or should be separate in standard writing. This is fi, shuhur, and then sana. In the months of the year. Okay, so two words, that's a ra and then the sin, they're joined together. So it's not standard at all. It's
Very struck in Mosaic texture.
very flowing.
I think it was a mistake.
No, it's not. They like doing it this way. Have a look at what comes next. Okay, now you have in the months of the year. Now you're going to get the units. Okay, you have a choice of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, or maybe nothing if there isn't a unit, but there is a unit here. So what do you have in Arabic?
Okay, I see.
Come on, guys, you're Arabic readers. Have a look.
This is not Arabic.
Yes, it is.
I'm looking at it and I'm kind of having trouble.
There is Tasab'a at the end. I
Okay,
think.
is that? Yeah. Okay, that's a lamb, and then that's something.
Okay, have a look at this. Suls.
Three.
Suls.
Tell
Yeah.
it.
Talit or suls. 3. Okay, that's good. Now we have the number 3. Now you're going to get the decades. Okay. So you have
7.
Was
wa sabain wa sabami'a. So 773 hijra. Very useful if you're in a slide test and you've forgotten the date of a building.
Okay,
Although
what's
then you
the-
can convert it into miladi.
What's the wave pattern like on the top of
Here,
the? No, in the corner.
point it out to me.
Corner left.
Point it out to me.
This daily.
Oh, that's the mi'a. That's the hamza and the tar marbuta at the end of 700.
Okay, so you can just combine those two.
Yeah. So this is the mi'a. Yeah. So it's an impressive example of calligraphy. They're obviously playing around with the forms, even if it's unorthodox. It's still carefully thought out. And following that, the next panel that I'm going to show you, it's a detail of this one that's the side of the door. So what techniques are we looking at here?
This is luster. This is these gold things.
There's no gold there.
What's that? It's background.
That's that's a beige color, which is unglazed brick. So this is molded, and so they have glazed just the upper portions that are in relief against the beige background. So this is carved and glazed terracotta. And what sort of pattern do we have?
An arabesque pattern based on Chinese lotus.
It's an arabesque pattern, yes. And again, yes, we have one of these large lotuses and other forms of it here, also in the spandrels, and coming from a vase at the bottom. We'll see that in other tile work techniques later as well. How about the framing panel here? This is actually another Chinese motif. It's a kind of waterweed pattern that's found in contemporary Chinese ceramics. But different technique here. Like to make a guess what it is? What are the colors? Blue and white. We have dark blue. There's a little bit of turquoise staining to white. So it's underglaze painted, yeah. So limited range. Okay, the second one on your list is the tomb of one of the wives of Timur Tumanagha, which dates from, well, quite a bit from over 30 years later, 1404. And this actually is a drawing of the plans and the elevations of the major mausoleums in the Shah-i-Zinda. Which one here is the corresponding elevation of this one?
13?
It's not actually 13, but one very like it. It's number 12. So what's the main difference between this, say, and the previous one we looked at, do you think? We actually didn't see the interior of the other one.
Did the other one have a dome?
The other one had a dome. The other one, I think, would have been, I'm actually not quite sure, but it's either number 5 or number 6, I think. One of these two. So what's the difference between this and this?
Okay, number 12 is like triple domed, and number 5 is.
Well, it's a double dome. So you have this large empty space between the dome and the interior, and the top of the dome on the exterior. So what's the
It's just like the bottom one, just an arch.
the bottom one is just a profile of an arch inside the building. That's right. Yeah, it's not a separate dome. So what's the point in having a double dome? Why?
It makes it look bigger from the outside.
Makes it look bigger from the outside. Okay, that's great. That's a very useful feature. Why don't you have the interior dome the same height? Why have a separate lower one on the interior?
Lack of money.
Don't think money was no object as far as Timur was concerned, or the buildings for his relatives.
Less interior space?
Well, it creates less interior space. Is that an advantage here?
Is this area prone to earthquakes, or lower down the line that would help?
Samarkand, not particularly bad, but you do have double domes in all areas of Iran, even in areas where they had earthquakes. It's more a question of proportions. Had there not been a lower dome here, it would have looked too tall and too narrow. I mean, we've seen that was a tendency in Il-Khanid buildings, but you can go too far. You can make it seem distorted almost. So just to keep the proportions to a more agreeable ratio, they have a lower interior dome. Okay, some tile work on the outside that might remind you of a building we looked at in the last class. Yes, you can see in fact it's spelling out sacred names. So now they're using this technique to decorate the outside of buildings as well. And one interesting feature about it is the way in which it is not parallel with the sides of the building, but it's rotated 45 degrees.
So is it related to the brickwork they had earlier?
Yes, there is in fact some brickwork that is unglazed in relief that has these same kinds of patterns, that even has this kind of square kufik. Excuse me, where are you off to?
I need tissue paper, I'm sorry.
Okay. So maybe, does anyone have a tissue paper? Maybe someone in the class has some. Anyone have some tissue paper? No? Okay.
Sorry.
So yes, it did exist earlier in Seljuk brickwork, but it's more obvious when it's glazed. The patterns are easier to distinguish. What's the advantage of having it in this 45-degree angle?
It's more dynamic, yeah. If it's like this, it's going to be boring.
Yeah, that's a good point. More dynamic, it creates more of a contrast with the rest of the building. There's another possible reason. You can see that the pattern, it's not broken off where it meets the rectangle. And in fact, you can get the idea of it extending beyond the horizons, or sort of as the... This is a frame and it extends infinitely in any direction beyond that. And especially if you have a pattern that includes sacred names, then this would be a way perhaps of...
Like the paintings in the frame?
Yes, like the paintings in the frame. Mm-hmm. But if you have sacred names, it may be a way of suggesting the infinite presence of God perhaps in the universe. That may be a bit far-fetched, but it's one thought. Now here's the entrance. We were looking at the back of that mausoleum. Now we're looking at the main entrance, which has a different kind of tile work. Although again, it's one that we saw in the last class. Have a look at your list and see if you can figure out which tile work we're looking at these. Well, no, just go down the list and look at some of the properties.
luster tiles?
No, no, it's not luster. You never get, for instance, a green in luster.
Oh, you guys
No. We actually had one example of it in the Yazd Friday Mosque Mihrab in the last class.
tile mosaic?
Yeah, this is tile mosaic. You have the range of colors. You have light blue, dark blue. We have dark green and this yellow ochre color. It varies slightly, in fact, even on the same building. And perhaps in the detail here, you can notice the breaks between the patches of color, how they're fitted together. This also gives the name of a calligrapher. Now, he's the person not who actually put the tile mosaic in place, but he's the person who would have written out the calligraphy on paper beforehand for the tile workers to copy when they were making it. And he's known, in fact, for having written some other Qurans in this period.
What's his name?
What's his name? Well, Khatte Sheikh Muhammad ibn Haji Bandgir at-Tokhrai at-Tabrizi. It's hard to read just from this. Tokhrai, what's a Tokhra? Anyone heard of Tokhra? Yeah, Tokhra is it's later became famous really as the very elaborate signature of the Ottoman sultans. But it was a dynastic symbol of the Turks. So a Tokhrai, he was somebody probably who was specialized in writing Tokhra signatures as well. What do you think we're looking at here? Well, it's tile work for sure, yes, but what kind of tile work?
Restoration.
It's part of a restoration campaign, that's right.
Yeah.
What technique are they replicating here in the restoration?
It's Lotus.
No, technique, not the motif, the technique.
Mosaic?
Yeah, tile mosaic. So this is where you start off with a pattern. Here you can see part of a stem and a leaf. Although you have little holes that are pricked around the outlines of the pattern. Why would you do that?
So it would be easier.
To cut, but they're not actually cutting them. Well, actually they have cut out some of them, that's true, yes. No, it's a technique for copying the pattern easily. Once you draw half of the pattern, if you prick around the outlines, turn it over and put charcoal on top, it'll go through the holes and leave the pattern on the other side without you having to draw it twice. So it's a labor-saving device in this way. And you start off with squares of tile like this. Now the advantage of this is that you can fire each of the different colors, where it's green, light blue, dark blue, etc., to the optimum temperature to get the best glaze. And then once you've done that, you cut them up and you make the little flowers or stems that are required for the pattern. You can fit different colors within the outlines of rosettes like this. And then you place them face down on the pattern that you've drawn. You can see a vase at the bottom here, for instance, some of the flower motifs. They'll be fitting all of that in, and when they filled it in, they cover it originally with mortar, of course, but nowadays they're using concrete. And this is actually a curved panel, but they have little hooks in it for bringing the whole thing up onto the wall. So that's how you make tile mosaic. You start on the ground with the pattern drawn on the paper. Okay, let's look at another much larger buildings associated with Timur. And one is the Friday Mosque of Timur, which is in the center of, or not quite in the center, but close to the center of Samarkand. That's here, number 2. We were looking before as well at number 6, which is the Shah-i-Zinda necropolis, just on the outskirts of the old city. And we'll be looking also at number 3 here, which is the mausoleum in which he ended up being buried. So, in brackets after that, the name Bibi Khanum is mentioned. Bibi Khanum was another name for one of his principal wives, Sarai Malak Khanum. And she had earlier built a madrasa opposite the site of the Great Mosque. And maybe later, because of her madrasa, her title got transferred to the mosque itself. But originally it was built as the new Friday mosque of the city. And here's the plan. Well, okay, we looked at some examples of mosque plans in the last class. Nada, how does this compare with the Varamin Friday mosque plan that we looked at in the last class? Or how would you describe this plan? What are its main features? You're not used to reading plans yet, maybe? No? Okay.
It has 4 iwans.
It has 4 iwans. First of all, that's is that similar or different to
Similar.
the Varamin Friday Mosque? That's similar. Okay.
And 4 domes. 3 domes, sorry.
2 domes?
3 domes.
3 domes. 3 domes. Yes, there's 1 Qibla dome chamber, 2 dome chambers behind the side iwans. Is that a new feature, or is that the same as Varamin?
Same feature. Oh, the other one has 4, right? Domes.
No, the other one just had 1 large dome chamber. So, in fact, this is a completely new feature. This is the first mosque that displays dome chambers behind the side iwans.
It's very symmetrical.
Very symmetrical. That's an important point. That's something that the Timurids were very much in favor of. And there's a reason here why they were able to have a large symmetrical mosque in an old city, which at this stage was difficult. I'll come back to that shortly.
Buildings down.
Exactly.
Urban renewal.
Yeah, urban renewal. But there's a particular reason for it in this case. Again, I'll come back to it in just a second, but keep that in mind.
It also seems to have more of a hyper style plan too.
Well, that's true. The areas between the iwans are hypostyle in plan. That is normal for earlier mosque plans too. One thing that isn't immediately obvious here maybe is the number of minarets. We have, well, 1, 2, 3, 4, but also at the corners. 5, 6, 7, 8 altogether. So it's a huge building. Now, it's a building that when Timur came back from his campaign in India, he decided wasn't big enough, wasn't impressive enough, and so the 2 supervisors who were in charge of it were hanged. That gives you an idea of how strongly he felt about having a building that was big enough to reflect his own importance. And we're fortunate in having, it's really an historical depiction of the building of this. It was done by a famous painter that we'll be looking at in the next class, Behzad. This was done, well, nearly 70 years or 80 years after the building was erected. So it's not an on-the-spot account of it, obviously, but there are several features of it that wouldn't have changed in the meantime, the building techniques that were being used. So he wanted things done in a hurry, so he has his overseer brandishing a stick at the various workers. We have woodworkers in the back here, someone using a plane, a saw as well. We have stone carvers, And there's an unusual amount of stone here. There were some stone quarries close to Samarkand which were used for decorative purposes for the most part. Most of the mosque is built of brick, but they had some carved stone decoration. And to help in bringing it, you not only had horses with carts and with large wheels, but elephants, which of course came from his Indian campaign. And then we have the brick workers here. They're mixing up mud and water to make mortar. They put the mortar onto these large troughs, and then the brick they can throw up onto these, the top of the Iwan where they're working. And there are some features here, such as the stone columns that have twisted
there's
bases.
there's a trace of twisted.
Oh, you can see it more easily here, that's right,
Yeah.
yes. Which replicate what they have found there in some parts. So this is a great reconstruction of the building techniques. It's not a painting that you would be able to reconstruct this plan from. It's not accurate in that respect, but it shows some of the main features. Here's, for instance, a panel of brick and tile already done, ready to be hoisted up onto the facades. So a couple of photographs of the actual building itself. This is the Qibla dome chamber. The size of the figures here will give you an idea of just how large Timur wanted and got the final building. And see if you can spot the difference between this and this. This is the same Qibla Iwan. What's the difference?
That one reconstructed.
Yeah, this one is reconstructed. Unfortunately, the Uzbek authorities are very keen on making things look like new so that tourists will be more impressed. So
You made it higher?
they made it higher. They supposedly rebuilt it to its original height. We're not quite sure, but it's...
the dome, I can see the dome from here. Like in the previous one.
And the previous one, you can see part of the dome. Well, I mean, the dome, it's true, would probably originally not have been visible from the courtyard, only from behind.
Looks like they might have skimped on the tile work.
Well, they haven't finished revetting this with new tile work, which I'm sure in the meantime has been done. These were taken about 20 years apart, and this last one was taken about 15 years ago. So in the meantime, it's probably all been rebuilt, unfortunately. This is one of the side domes behind the side Iwan. And this is one of the new features that we have here. The hypostyle areas were relatively low. This shows you what the height of the roof of the hypostyle areas would have been. And here's a view of the back of the Qibla dome chamber, which shows you the same type of decoration on the mausoleum.
The black outline. It's weird.
I'm not sure if this is black actually or dark blue. It could be just the poor color reproduction of the slide. It's probably dark blue, I think, rather than black. But again, it's different names. And the important thing here is that you can actually see the outside of the building. A decorated outside is really something relatively new for large mosques within a city, because, well, like the Isfahan Friday Mosque, they may have been surrounded by a bazaar before, they may have expanded organically, and there wouldn't have been a possibility of decorating an outside wall, or maybe there just weren't outside walls. But here, there's a very interesting story of one of the visitors to the court of Timur. Rui Gonzalez de Clavijo was the ambassador from the King of Castile, the area of northern Spain, to Timur. And he wrote a fascinating account of his travels. It's been translated into English, probably into Arabic as well. It's well worth reading if you're interested in it, which gives a great flavor of what life was like at the court at the time. And he tells us how when Timur wanted to build a new bazaar in the city of Samarkand, he ordered his men to knock down all the houses that were in the way of it, that he had picked for his location. The owners of the houses naturally were very upset with this, and so they pleaded with some intermediaries, Sayyids, descendants of the Prophet, who had Timur's ear, who he was particularly kind to bring this up with him. When they did, Timur said he got very angry, and he said, "What do you mean? I'm the owner of all of Samarkand. I can show you my rights to all the property tomorrow if you want," which is not the usual way an Islamic ruler would have conducted himself in any city. This was, of course, just a measure of his own ego and intolerance. But given that he was able to do this for the bazaar, we don't have a record of it for the Friday Mosque, but it's evident that he must have done the same thing here, just the equivalent of bulldozed anything that was in his way, he ordered demolished, and as a result he was able to have this fabulous symmetrical building with complete exterior decoration. Okay, the last one of Timur we're going to look at is one that actually was built not for himself originally, but for his grandson, Muhammad Sultan, who had earlier built a madrasa and a khanqa. You remember what a khanqa is? We had one of those in the Abd as-Samad complex.
It's a
Place where Sufis live, yeah. So when he died, Timur built a mausoleum for him. That's D on the plan, this octagonal structure. Here is a section of it showing you the double dome, the interior of the main mausoleum, and the crypt, which is underneath where the body was actually buried. So, I mean, this is just a symbolic commemorative area.
How is the building called?
It's on your list, the Ghori Amir. Okay, so Ghor is a tomb, the tomb of the Amir, or sometimes it's shortened to Ghori Mir, simply. You'll see that as well. And this is one which Clavijo reports in his account that Timur also, when he came back from traveling and saw it, decided that it was too low, ordered it to be rebuilt higher, and according to Clavijo, it was knocked down and rebuilt in 10 days to a higher state. Now that's hardly believable. Although what is believable perhaps is that maybe they kept the lower parts and they just made the drum and the outer dome higher, because this, to me again, the proportions seem too elongated here, uncomfortably tall. But just making it taller without widening the base would have been a quick way of achieving this tall effect. So other things you might want to notice here are the form of the dome. How would you describe that?
Ribbed.
It's ribbed, which is also like some that were in the Shah-i-Zinda. It has a tall drum with Kufic script on it, and the same kind of square Kufic on the walls of the lower octagon. And the interior, in fact, was also fairly recently restored by the authorities in Uzbekistan. It has elaborate painting in gold and dark blue on top of sometimes a molded stucco ground. The arabesques in the squinches and in the dome are slightly in relief, which makes it a little bit more interesting, but it's also a little bit surprising that he didn't use more tile work in the interior. Now, there were some other questions that people had asked last time. That one was, what's the difference between overglazed and underglazed painting? Somebody else wanted to know how they would go about reading plans. What sort of advice can we give to somebody who wants to learn how to read plans?
Wikipedia.
No, don't think so. I mean, there are lots of plans of buildings available on the internet, of course, but unless you can match up what you see in the plan with what you see in the building, it's not going to help. That's how you learn how to interpret it. So the best way is to go to a source which has lots of photographs of the building and the plans. Any sources like that you know of related to Islamic art, for instance?
The textbook.
The Creswell, yes. Creswell has big volumes that are on reserve. They're on reference in the main library and in the rare book library. The textbook would only normally have just one photograph of a building and a plan at most. But Creswell has dozens, in some cases, photographs of buildings. So, I mean, the second volume of the Muslim architecture of Egypt, that has some examples of Mamluk architecture that we'll be looking at in this class. So that would be a good place to start. For instance, the complex of Qalaun is one we'll be looking at and we'll be going to visit as well. Qalaun, or it's sometimes spelt Qalaun. That's one that he has very extensive photographs of. So if this is a problem, go to Creswell and match up what you see in the photographs with the plans. That should do the trick for you. What else do we have? Yes, someone asks, are there any features influenced by earlier Islamic art in Egypt? I'm not sure if the person's talking about art in Iran, the ones that we were looking at in the Mosque. There are actually a few examples of Iranian influence in Egypt. We'll see one in the Madrasa for Nasser Muhammad, the son of Qalaun, which is one we'll also go and visit in one of the field trips. But the other way around, surprisingly, I can't really think of any influence. Cairo was particularly receptive to ideas coming from other places. But there certainly are lots of features in Syria that they have in common with Egypt as well, but not so much in Iran. What brought Chinese influence in Islamic art? That's another question. What do you think the answer could be? Trade, yeah. The bringing in of Chinese artifacts, which the Muslim artisans copied. When did trade particularly surge? When did it increase all of a sudden?
When they found that route, the Mongol invasion.
When they found which route? When who found which route?
You find that? Well, people have been going to China on land for like a long time. So I mean,
Yeah.
it's probably been like after the Mongol invasions with the Pax Mongolia.
After the Mongol invasion, the Pax Mongolia, the peace of the Mongols, which created an area that for a change was under the rule of one family, all the way from China in the east to the Mediterranean. So now you had Chinese goods flooding in. They would have come in regularly, but compared to what was available, more of a trickle before. But now it was a huge surge. And this is when you get the first Chinese-style dragons, the first Chinese-style phoenixes, the first Chinese-style lotuses, etc. And they remain constant features of Islamic art from then onwards. The Yazd Iwan, who started the geometric or leaf design? Well, I mean, there are two different types of designs relative there. The leaf design, geometric leaf design, maybe this is the arabesque someone's talking about. How do we get arabesques developing?
Samara style suit?
Yes. The earlier kind derived from classical ones usually aren't symmetrical. An arabesque is a vegetal design that is symmetrical, can be repeated over any area. And the Samara styles are abstract. Arabesques frequently do use a kind of abstract version of vegetation. So it starts very early on in Islamic art, and as we'll see, it's a constant of decoration in later periods. Okay, we'll move on to some of the buildings then that were sponsored by Shah Rukh and his family. Mashhad. What does Mashhad mean?
Scene.
It means a place of witnessing. Mm-hmm.
Like a martyrium.
But like a martyrium, a place of witnessing where a martyr died for Islam in particular. So it comes to be associated with a place of pilgrimage, in other words. Who is the famous saint, if you like, then, who was buried here that Muslims would have gone on pilgrimage to? In Mashhad, this is in Khorasan in northeast Iran, near the capital of Shah Rukh, Herat. The Imam Reza, okay, one of the 12 Shia imams, so very important person. And there had been a mausoleum earlier erected to him in this part. Yeah?
I was wondering if they kept moving the bodies around every now and then and build a new mausoleum here, move the body.
No, that can happen sometime, that bodies are exhumed and reburied somewhere else, but more often they knock down an earlier mausoleum and build a new, more impressive one on top of it. So, yeah, there had been an earlier mausoleum here. What Gohar Shad did was to build a new Friday mosque and two smaller areas, a Dar al-Sa'ada and Dar al-Hafaz. Dar al-Sa'ada, that's where the Sayyids would have stayed, the descendants of the Prophet. Dar al-Hafaz would be what? Hafaz is the plural of Hafiz, who is what?
To learn Quran.
Somebody who's memorized the Quran. So this is where Quran recitators would have stayed or recited the Quran constantly. But the most impressive building on the site, of course, is the Friday Mosque. Zainab, what about the plan of this? What type of building is it? What's this feature? An Iwan, okay. How many of these do we have around the courtyard? Here's one. Yeah, 4 Iwan. So similar to to which earlier mosque? Anyone? Friday Mosque of Timur in Samarkand, the one we've seen today, or the Varamin. So it's a typical Iranian mosque plan. How many domes does it have? One. There's one major Qibla dome chamber here. And here's the view of the Qibla dome chamber. So Magid, looking at the one on the left, which earlier building that we have seen does this remind you of? What feature of
Feature?
Timur's Friday Mosque does it recall?
the spandrel and script?
Well, I mean, they all would have these large thuluth inscriptions.
The tiles?
It certainly is extensively tiled, so that has that in common with the
And minarets?
Samarkand example. And it has minarets that are attached to the sides of the Iwan as well, so that's another point of comparison. But there's another interesting feature, which is the view into the Qibla dome chamber, which is like what earlier building? The Yazd Friday Mosque, exactly.
Just there.
Yeah, it doesn't have a back. The Iwan is all open all the way into the Qibla dome chamber. So this is,
This looks more like a gate than a
Is that
yeah,
person
that's
at
right.
the bottom?
That's right.
dome.
Yes. Oh, wait a second, is it?
Okay, that thing is huge, if that's true.
Actually, no, I don't think it is. So a
Okay.
person would be a little bit taller, but it is huge. It is very
Okay.
impressive, yeah. And there is detail here of the end of the inscription. And in fact, there are two interesting bits. One is this.
We have another one of those simultaneous.
We have another one of those that you have to put your head on the side to read properly. But there's let me just talk about this one first, which is, it starts off with Amal, so it's a craftsman signature. In fact, it's the work of Gavamuddin Ash-Shirazi. And he, we know from other sources, was the court architect. Now, in fact, he prefaces his signature with Abd Daif al-Mihtaj bi-inayat Allah. So he's giving all these phrases indicating how poor he is, but it's a way, in fact, of increasing the attention that he's getting in this signature panel. It's a way of making it larger and more important.
There's another sign style on the right.
Yes.
For this?
Well, I mean, the style of that is actually very similar to this.
So it's different.
And here's another little arabesque panel. It's hard to see here, but there's another vase at the bottom that the panel is coming out of. Let me just see if I can rotate this. It's not that easy if you're not used to the names that are present here. There are a couple of names here that are three names, in fact, but two of them at least are very familiar to you from
Sameh?
since we've been talking about them today. And there's even a date at the end, which is also nice to know. What's the date? The date is in figures. It's not written out. It's in numerals. It's in numerals.
831.
It's 821.
21.
Oh,
Yeah.
what?
The
Okay, which inscription are we reading?
this one.
Okay.
It's on its side.
The white.
The white one. Yeah. I mean, okay. We have another one on top, which is simply Al Mulk Lillah repeated. Sovereignty is God's in Kufic at the top. But this one, as I say, there are three names that are, two of which are very familiar to you. Shah is part of one of them. Ibn, yes, we have a genealogy here.
Sameh?
No,
Sahem.
no. This is Shah.
Sahem.
Shah
So what's the
Shah.
Rukh. Shah Rukh.
Shahrukh.
We've been talking about him. Okay, who was Shah Rukh the son of? Ibn. Who was he the son of? Yes. So where's Timur? Timur. Okay. This last one is Gurkhan, which is a word for son-in-law, a title that he got when he married a daughter of Genghis Khan to establish his Mongol sovereignty. So we have Shahrukh ibn Timur. We also have somebody ibn Shahrukh. This is actually one that is done by Baysaghor. It's an unusual Turkish name, I know, but you're going to hear it again in the next class because he was also the patron of many great manuscripts at the court of Shah-Rukh. And what is before here, something that is missing, is Katabahu. In other words, he was the calligrapher of this. So he was obviously a superb calligrapher. This is a wonderful bit of design in Thuluth calligraphy, I think. So it's quite an impressive ensemble. This is a view of the rest of the courtyard.
Are these blue tiles?
Well, they're tiles. They're not on the courtyard. No, it's just a shadow.
What's the shaft?
The shaft.
Yes. Or the ditch? Or is that a fountain?
This no, it's a reflection in water. It's a pool of water. It's a reflection of the upper walls. What's interesting here are different about the area between the Iwans.
There's a building.
That's from another building that's behind the building. It's behind this one. That's true. But something else that's a bit unusual.
Floor?
There are 2 floors.
But that's not that new.
It's double story.
Is it new?
Mm-hmm.
Because there were 2 floors in the madrasas.
Yes. Yes, that's right. But in a mosque. In a mosque, this is something different. But
Is it a functional second?
that's a very good question. Let's have a look at the building from the outside
The answer?
to determine it.
Probably is no.
Here you can see the rear of this 2-story arcade. And the roof, in fact, is at a lower level. So it's just a false facade. It's something that you can impress the viewer with inside the courtyard of the building.
Yeah,
But,
outside of the
but outside it looks false. But in fact, you never would have seen this from the outside normally. You can only see an outside of the building now because the Shah of Iran in the 1970s tore down all the buildings in this area. This was completely covered with buildings before. This is one of the reasons why it was so unpopular. Autocratic moves like this. And so, in fact, you really wouldn't even have noticed it from the outside normally. But this emphasis on facade architecture, it's a continuation of what we had in the Varamin Friday Mosque, and it's obviously an important feature to the Timurids as well.
So if the facade from the inside was so important, why didn't they work on from the outside also?
Because you couldn't see it. It actually was built in the middle of a bazaar. This was actually part of the bazaar. This is the roof of it that went all the way towards the dome over the imam. So it already was a densely settled urban area.
That's why the outside edges of the plans always look really off.
Yes.
Weird,
Yeah.
because it's like Tetris.
Yeah, so very different from what it would have been. Okay, we'll have to stop there. So I'll finish off with architecture of the Timurids next class, and then we'll go on to mostly painting, book painting.